Welcome to Tales About the Table, where we explore the stories, challenges, and creative chaos of TTRPGs, but mostly D&D. I'm Elijah.
I'm Jack.
And I'm Josiah. Together, we discuss the art of DMing, character building, and making unforgettable moments at the table.
Each episode, we break down a different aspect of tabletop gaming, sharing our experiences, lessons learned, and maybe a few funny failures along the way. Whether you're a seasoned DM or you're just rolling your first set of dice, there's always more to learn about collaborative storytelling.
Sometimes we talk about how to play TTRPGs, the rules, the setup, and everything in between.
Sometimes we talk about how to be better people and communicators, and therefore, better players.
And sometimes we talk about our own misadventures and the lessons that we've learned from the worlds we've created.
But most importantly, we love telling great stories together.
So pull up a chair and join us as we share another of our many tales about the table. Hey everyone, and welcome back to Tales About the Table. I am Elijah, joined as always by Jack and Josiah, and today we are going to be talking about one of, if not the most important thing in running the campaign that you are going to be running in your TTRPG, and that is the world itself. More specifically, world building. Putting together the worlds that you are playing in is a huge part of the DM's job, but we don't think that it's entirely up to the DM to run all of the world building pieces. We think players are involved as well. And so we are going to kind of just jump right into that today. And I think one of the big questions that kind of gets asked about world building is how much of world building should be done before you start and how much of it can happen, 2 sessions in, 3 sessions in, 50 sessions in on these long-term campaigns. And the person that I know who is really excited to talk about this today is Jack. So Jack, if I were to ask you how much of your world building should be done completely before you start, and I said, hey, take a stab at it, what would you say?
Yeah, thanks. I would say that you should have a theme. And that truly, I think, is one of the most foundational things. I do not claim to personally have this. This is advice I heard from Matthew Mercer on a podcast he did with Brennan Lee Mulligan. And he talked about how he was like, if you can just have one thing before you're starting, it's this idea of like, have a theme, have some common story element that you are building this around that is going to come back up throughout your campaign. That can be kind of the basis. And I'll give you, a few examples. I heard this from actually another guy talking about D&D stuff. He was like, if you can find 20 pieces of media that evoke the feeling and theme that you're going for when you do, when you're prepping your game, and just start there, whether that's music, movies, stories, artwork that you find, something that is just like, yep, that's a part of this world. And I can go back to that for inspiration and to keep this theme in my mind and in my, head as I'm planning this stuff. And so I think that's really important, starting your game off with like a theme. And you truly don't need a ton prepped. Honestly, I think it's better, and we'll get into this later, the less you prep about your world in some ways, the more that your players can have an active role in creating it with you. And maybe once you're 4 or 5 game sessions in, you're beginning to get a feel for your players, you're beginning to get a feel, that's when you go and you start writing, a bunch more onto that stuff and really, smoothing off some of the rough edges and not flying by the seat of your pants as much once you start to get an idea of what's going on. But before you start, one of the best campaigns we ever, played in or DM'd was we started with the theme of steampunk. And we're like, man, steampunk's pretty cool. And that set the tone for the music and the set pieces, and everything had this theme behind it. And it wasn't the most important part of the campaign, but it definitely got us into it so much more quickly. And I think that was really helpful.
Yeah, I think so much of this, and this will sort of permeate our whole conversation in and through it, you'll sort of see this idea make sense. But understanding the reason why you do things, I think, is super important as well. Just doing something because someone said, hey, do this. This makes a good world. It can be helpful, but understand why you're doing something. There are different ways to do things for different worlds. Some of your worlds may seem a little bit more mysterious. Some of them might be really in-depth. Some of them, you might want all of your characters to have an in-depth understanding of every other character. You're going to explain a bunch of stuff beforehand. And in other worlds, you really want your characters to come in and really explore and discover a lot of the world as they go. And in some of those cases, a lot of that, you can kind of build the world as you go as well, depending on how much you want to build that ahead of time. It just depends on what kind of world you're creating, and understand that you need to have a reason for why you're doing the things. Because if you have a reason why you want it to be mysterious, if you have a reason for, I didn't do player descriptions at the beginning, I didn't do summaries of my locations, like my characters didn't know much about this town that they were going to, have a reason for why that is, or like understand why you're doing what you're doing as far as world building goes. And I think that's going to take you a long way with anything that you do. And I think this is going to continue through our conversation as well.
Yes, I think that it is super important when you are world building. I always have joked with my players that when I start world building, I build a playlist on Spotify of music that gets me into the mood of what I want my world to feel like. Because if I can tell you what my world sounds like, I can describe all of the visuals. And that may be the case for some people, that may not be the case for others. But yeah, I do think it goes back to that theming and knowing what's the world about. Mm-hmm. Obviously, this is going to peek a little bit into our session 0 talk from before of like, hey, don't prep a world that your players don't want to play in. You know, if everyone hates horror and scary things, don't prep a body horror campaign. That doesn't seem like a good option. Right. Obviously, you want to know that. But the thing that I get into is I am one to get carried away with my world building. And I want to lay out 50 pages of lore about the history of this world and why everything is there. And it gets to a point where not literally, but sometimes gets to a place where it's like, okay, and this is why this door is here. And this is who laid the door here and who built the door and when it was built and the wood that it was built from. And that is awesome for this thing that we like to talk about called verisimilitude. But that is not super awesome when you have to create an entire world and there's not enough time in the world for you to do that just for the room that you're sitting in listening to this podcast, much less for an entire adventure of things. And so I know that verisimilitude means a lot to my players. And so I do have to find a balance between how do I make everything feel like it fits. And I know that it's going to look different when I am just playing with Jack and Josiah versus when I am playing with Josiah, Jack, and 2 other players at the table. But I know that verisimilitude is important to both of you for very different reasons. So let's talk some verisimilitude in your world building and what is important there.
Specifically, real quick before we keep going, we will probably bring up this word quite a bit. And it was not a word I knew when we first started, went down this rabbit hole. So I'm not going to assume you guys know it. Quick, easy definition to especially know how we are talking about it. I don't pretend to be a dictionary here, but it's the idea of believability in your world. It is this idea that I don't look at this world and I go, what the heck? There are times where you're reading a book and you're like, it's just pulling me out of the story because it's so unbelievable. It's so, not real, not reflective of real life. And that's kind of what verisimilitude is. And I will say it is unique to each person. You will have specialized information about the world. And when somebody doesn't, their story doesn't reflect that, you are going to be pulled out of that story a little bit because you realize, man, that's not how the world is. And that makes it hard for me to, yeah, totally. If a geologist who knows a ton about rock formations and how they happen naturally, if they sit down and are reading a book and this person is describing this fantastic rock formation, and the geologist goes, that doesn't happen in nature. That's impossible for that to happen. And they're like, they just sit there and they're like, this shouldn't bother me, but it does. And it's pulling me out of the story. And now I can't enjoy this, or your specialization might be engineering. And you go, that's not how that works. Like that structure wouldn't work like that, and there are places where we have specialized knowledge, wherever it is. And we like to incorporate, maybe you like economics a ton. Maybe you like to know natural wind formations, and like how storms, and so you build a world that's like a river would go here, a river wouldn't go over there, and it would need to be traveling downhill and it needs to go towards you, and like all these other things. And you're like, but not every player cares about that. That is not every DM cares about that. And so the beauty of D&D is that if you write a book, verisimilitude has to apply to everyone who could possibly read your book. When you play D&D, you know who is participating with your story. And so verisimilitude becomes incredibly subjective for your table. And there is this place where, because Elijah knows me and Josiah, he knows what creates verisimilitude for us. And you learn that as a DM as you start to play. You learn that it's like, hey, we are going to create a world that they can really sink their teeth into and feel like they're there and participate in it. And there are things for me, like one of the things that I am somewhat skilled in as a person is social interaction and understanding why people do what they do. And so when character motivations just do not make sense, it bugs the heck out of me. I'm like, people aren't that way. Not just like, that's a weird action for a person, but where it's like, no, like I have evidence that this is different in the real world. People behave differently consistently in the real world. And if they're doing this, there should be some sort of explanation for why. It's not that they couldn't make that decision. It's just there must be some bit of information I'm missing here. And that often, this is world building. When somebody makes a decision that maybe wouldn't reflect reality, there is a place where you can give an explanation. And that completes the verisimilitude. That's where the player goes, there's an explanation for it. It makes sense, puts it to the side, and continues enjoying it.
If I may make a quick aside, Jack's ability to hey, people wouldn't normally act like that unless something else was going on, has ruined many a twist villain for me.
That is a bad part of me. Might I say that is a weakness of me as a player, because that does detract from the game. I do admit I have done that. It is not the healthiest part of me as a D&D player.
Jack just immediately is like, that's weird. You might have other motivations. Must be a villain. And I just look at him and I'm like, not for like 7 more sessions, but sure. Yep, you got it.
And there is this place where honestly, you bring up a really good point. As a player, when these moments happen, it is your job somewhat to keep them from the DM. Maybe afterwards, after the session, you can talk to him and explain some of your feelings or your thoughts, especially if it's really pulling you out of the game. But like, it is somewhat your job to not put this on the DM's shoulder in the middle of the session. And I admit, I struggle with this. I do a bad job. When stuff comes up, I'm like, Elijah, I don't think that they would do it. Like, like, Elijah, that seems really weird,
and that's what they do.
Yeah. And there's just a place to accept it. Maybe you can have a good and fun, if you're close to the DM and your friends, maybe you can talk about it afterwards. And I will say, as a DM, it is sometimes helpful when I get those things pointed out and I go, oh yeah, there are holes here. I should create an explanation for it. Because it's not always like, oh, everything's ruined. It's often like, well, let's just make another explanation. And this brings me to a phrase that I introduced both Elijah and Josiah to today, called turtles all the way down. And I like this, and I think it's really helpful for world building. But it comes from this idea of like the world's on the back of a turtle. And the philosopher says, well, what's the turtle on then? What's the turtle walking on? And the person answers, well, another turtle. And he goes, well, what's that turtle on? And the guy's like, another turtle. And the guy, the questioning continues, and he's like, it's turtles all the way down. The answer is always, there's just another turtle. That's the explanation for what it's standing on. And this is a world building concept where you often do need to give an explanation. But as the person continues to dig, it's like you just give another explanation and another explanation. And in writing, they often suggest, like, to use it colloquially, like build 1 or 2 turtles down, for stuff. So if the reader wants to pry at your world a little bit, they're like, there's an answer. There must be answers all the way down. they must have thought of everything. And it's like, no, you didn't. You just thought of one or maybe two steps down, and the reader's satisfied and believes your world. In D&D, it's even easier because, again, you don't have to satisfy every reader out there. You have to satisfy your players. And there's this place where it's like, it may only take a turtle here or a turtle there. And when they dig, you create turtles and you put them underneath that to explain that. I hope that makes sense. I know I'm talking about turtles and that's distracting, but I hope that helps you kind of understand, like, you don't need an answer for everything with your world building. You just need an answer where the player characters are digging.
Yeah. I also think all around this conversation of verisimilitude, like trying to create a world that the players feel like is believable. One thing that I think we have realized when we're playing, and one thing that has been very helpful for our games and our worlds to understand, or to make them more believable, to make them be like, oh, I feel connected to this world. I understand what it is, how it works, is sort of coming across this question of, wouldn't my character know this? And trying to get ahead of those questions. If you can, before you start, say, hey, here's all of the things your character would know that are like big deals about this world. It's like, I feel like my character would know how the local politics work. I feel like my character would know the neighboring country. I feel like my character would know the name of the barkeep that he goes to every week. Like there are some of these things where it's like, when you go there and you're like, what's the barkeep's name? I don't know. Go ask him. I don't know who the name of the barkeep is. I'm here every day. This is my hometown. I feel like I should know this. The statement of, I feel like I should know this, is what breaks verisimilitude often. If you can get across some of those ideas really early on and express, here are the things that your character would know, that helps tremendously get your players into the head of their characters, because then they're able to understand. Then, like for me, when I know the things that my character knows, I feel way more confident to make a decision, because it's not like I'm not afraid that I'm going to make a decision and then my DM's going to be like, well, actually, that was a pretty stupid decision because your character would have known that this guy was here and that would totally wreck that plan. And it's like, I didn't realize my character knew that. My bad. Let me change what I did. You know what I mean? Like, that takes you out of it. And so to get ahead of that, I think helps tremendously. And that's one of the big questions I think that helps you.
Yes.
I do think.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say, sure thing. I do think it's on the player too, though, to ask that question. Because the DM can't lay out everything because it doesn't know where the story's going to go. And sometimes it's up to the player to be like, I feel like, respectfully, I feel like I should know this. And if the DM says, actually, no, there's a good reason you don't. Great. Turtles all the way down. But if there is a place where the DM's like, no, actually, yeah, you would know this. Here's information, like giving it to the DM respectfully like that, I think is very good.
And as a DM, it is so important to just say yes. A lot of times, I know when I get into world building, it's like, oh, I built this super awesome, deep political system. And it's like, okay, my players should have an understanding of this. And so it is pretty common at our table for Jack and Josiah to say, I'm pretty sure I would know about this. And I'm like, you absolutely would. And so we kind of press pause on the action for a moment. And I say, yes, this is what you know about this. I give them the quick rundown. And it is so awesome that they're used to it at this point that I don't even have to say okay, now we can jump back in, because then Jack or Josiah, or whoever I've told this to, will kind of just be like, hey, and they'll start conversation in character, mentioning the information that I just gave them. And it feels a little redundant at times because it's like, well, you just learned this. It is so awesome to be able to jump into that, because verisimilitude and making it feel like a believable world helps the entire story move along. Go ahead.
We all had stuff to say. Go for it.
To jump on this and make this a little bit less stressful as well, it is okay to say, you're absolutely right. Your character would know that. I haven't fleshed out how the political structure works out yet.
Yes.
We're going to come back to this next episode. I'm going to do some prep and design the political scene, and then I'll like send you an email.
Yeah.
Or we'll talk about it at the beginning of next session, because you can't prep for everything.
Yeah. And that right there is like, it is so healthy for players to ask the question of the DM, like, feel like I should know this. Because that, DMs, if you ever hear that, that is a compliment to you. It means your player wants to know about your world.
Yes.
They're asking for a lore dump. That's incredible. Every DM wants that. But DMs feel stressed because it's like, I don't have that answer ready. You uncovered you asked for the turtle underneath and it's not there yet. But there is a place to say, hey, I'm not Superman. I don't have it all figured out. I'm not perfect at this. I'm going to build a turtle. I see you overturning that rock. I'm going to build a turtle and I'll give it to you as soon as it's done. I don't want to just give you some crazy answer off the top of my head. Like, I want this to fit with the rest of the world.
You
Give me a
can.
second.
Yeah,
Totally
make up a
can.
turtle.
But if that stresses you out,
Yes.
take that second, let them know. And yes, that has the potential to break verisimilitude. But I think it is a better, talking to people is more important than verisimilitude. Like, communication is more important. And so it's like, I'd rather break that a little bit and neither of you guys get stressed and enjoy the game a little bit more than really focus on that as the most important thing.
Yes. The other thing that I will tack on to that thought that I have secretly done, and maybe not so subtly all the time, but sometimes I've really gotten away with it, is if you're nearing the end of your session and you feel that they're about to pull back a rock that you don't have prepped, you can be like, well, with that, we'll end here, because you know where you've prepped to and what your world is built to. And this is where I'd like to talk pretty briefly about the difference between prepping a session and world building. World building, as far as I will define it, and some people may have a different definition, that's totally okay, but I will say that world building is what you fall back on. It is the set in stone, I'm going to use air quotes there for set in stone, of your campaign. That means that this town is part of the world. This town's political structure is part of the world. It will always be there, even if the players go off on this great and mighty quest and they raid a dragon's lair and they come back with a hoard of treasure. This town, its political structure, its people will still be there. Prep is the dragon's lair. It is figuring out what else is happening in the world. And all prep goes into world building. Once you've finished your prep file, that can just be added to the bottom of the world building file, because that is now part of the world once the players have played into it. World building isn't the same as prep. I can do a lot of world building and have no story and no forwardness for my players in my campaign.
No monsters.
Key example of this is I wrote a 750-year history of a world that we were playing in and we had been playing in for about a year. And I wrote about 18 pages of history for this world. And I realized after I had gotten done that I had done no prep for the session, except that there was going to be a book that my players could find in this dungeon that would have the history of this land of Tethamathia. Spoiler alert, for those of you DMs out there that already know what this is, they did not find the book in which I wrote all of this history out. So it is there elsewhere in the world as well for them to find, but it exists, right? And so that is a key example of how world building is not prepping for a session. It does take a lot of prep. You have to, put some effort into it. Now, I want to come back to the world being set in stone. And I'm going to take my air quotes off. It is set in stone, but like our world, it can grow and it can change. Istanbul is now Constantinople, and the town that your players maybe have known for quite some time, they leave for a couple of weeks. Allow things to change. Don't make it so that they always have to come back to a peaceful and fantastic town that is just waiting for them to activate. No, something can happen. They can install a new mayor or king or whatever. Something can go on in your world. And that is so, so important. Obviously, going back to verisimilitude again, if I leave for 2 days and the mayor is a completely different person when I get back, I'm going to have a lot of questions as a player. And so you as a DM need to know what the answer is to, hey, why is there a new mayor 2 days later? And maybe that is, oh, well, you guys stumbled into this town like 6 weeks into a political plot that I've been hanging hooks for in front of you for the last 6 sessions, and none of you took notice of it. And sometimes the answer is, oh, I guess I didn't think about that.
Mhm.
Again, turtles all the way down as they need to
And
figure
I
the
will
answer.
say, sometimes creating the answer to a question to make an explanation brings you to some of the best world building that you would have never thought of. You know, it's like, oh, shoot, I made this mayor. There's some political machinations going on in the background. The players are like, oh, that's interesting. Can we find out more about that? And you go, sure you can. And you start unraveling this
Next
political
session after I write all the rest of the background information on it.
But this method of world building, which it's like this active world building while you're going through it with your players, it creates such a more dynamic world because you're creating what they're interested in. And you are letting them be interested in things and overturn rocks. And then it's like, yes, I'll create here because you guys want to know what's here. And giving them a bunch of different threads that they could pull on in your world building. And when they don't pull on it, move on. And this is something, I don't think I'm disagreeing with you here, Elijah, but it is a little different. I read this somewhere, and I think it's very true for how I do DMing. And me and Elijah are very different DMs. If it doesn't come out in gameplay, it's not canon. And there is a place where you can write all this stuff, and because of how the session went, you're like, man, all this world building I wrote and have in these files kind of conflicts with where I really think this prepping for my next session could go. And guess what? None of the players at the table know any of this world building. I'm just going to cut some of that loose, trim it down to the stuff that fits with this, and rewrite some of it. Because guess what? Your audience doesn't know yet. It's not canon yet. And then for the stuff that's canon, I keep a different file where it's like, okay, this came out at the table. We're going to put this over here so that I remember that it's canon, because you will get confused. But yeah. Anyway, I interrupted you there, Elijah. So.
No, and I think that where I was going with this was kind of wanted to get you guys into thinking about world building. And so I have 7 questions that I ask myself when I get started.
It's lab time. Let's do some practical work.
Exactly. I've boiled them down to 5 because 6 and 7 are very much session 0 questions of like, hey, who's playing? What are we playing as? Because I like to incorporate, hey, if I have a party that is all fighters, it can be really interesting to add some things to the world about groups of fighters that typically go around. Those sorts of small little things. So who's playing is important to me when I start my world building. But the first question, like Jack had said early at the beginning of this episode, is what is the core theme or the tone of the world? I have built worlds based solely off of, hey, this is going to be steampunk. That's one of our favorite campaigns. I have also built a world off of like just wild hypothetical questions about what would happen if people walked on their hands, and I started world building for like a short story. And so, yeah, there is a core theme or a tone or just a specific belief. That is one of my first questions that I like to ask. And so when you're building your world, what's the tone? What do you want it to be? Josiah, I will let you do the lab work here. So I'm going to have you build a world here. What do you want the core theme of the world that we're building right now to be?
Superheroes.
Superheroes. Awesome. That means superheroes exist. Amazing. Now, the second thing is, what is the central conflict or major challenge that is at the center of your world? Anytime that you're going to build a world, something has to be happening. Otherwise, your characters are just going into a flat, stagnant nothingness. So what's going on with superheroes?
People's powers aren't working.
People's powers aren't working. Now, that is very fun. Now, I don't want this next question to build off of that too much, but it can if you would like to. What cultural or political influences are impacting your...
Not everyone has superpowers.
Okay.
Superheroes are elitist. But they don't need money. So all of the non-superhero people are super wealthy.
Interesting. I was about to say that this is starting to sound like the world of The Boys.
Yeah,
And then immediately Josiah was like,
When-
but money is not important. And the reason that I was going to bring up that this kind of sounds like The Boys is I like this question a lot, which is what makes your world unique compared to any other setting? Why is it that your world
Superheroes
of
don't need
superheroes-
money. That's so unique.
I mean, that
I
is
don't know
super
why.
unique. I don't know why.
We'll need a turtle underneath that turtle, but
Exactly. Right? Awesome. And then the fifth question that I will ask you for, if we're setting up this campaign and we're going to be world building, how do your players impact the world?
They are right in the middle of where this power phenomena not working started. So they're like right at the epicenter of it. They were present when it started happening.
Nice. And there you have it. That is, you have a world, right? There isn't a whole lot more that needs done to have the start of a world. You have something tangible. You can add in the time that it's set in, the period that it's set in, what the world looks like. But those 5 questions build you a world, right? Jack, what else would you say are some questions that you would ask when beginning to create your world?
So we have so many.
For Josiah's lab work to continue.
Yeah. For sure. And I want to state here too, I hope that you are going along with some of these, and we do not claim to have the edge on like, this is the 5 questions you should ask. You should find questions to ask. And I hope these help you, because the more questions you ask, the more answers you get. And that's the beauty of what we were talking about before. The more questions your players ask, the more answers you create, and the more your world becomes living and breathing. So we hope this starts you out here.
Yeah, I'd like to make a full disclaimer. I'm pretty sure at least 3 of these questions came directly from ChatGPT when I needed some inspiration. But like, these are not even my questions that I asked on it. So
some of these are mine.
Yes, these are some of them I have been like, oh, this is, but yeah, I definitely, cultural and political influences impacting your world really was not a question that I asked myself regularly. And then it became really important because it was really fun.
This is great.
For sure. So continuing this world building, Josiah, I got a question for you.
I'm coming up with these on the fly, so I have no idea what we're doing here.
I know, we didn't prep at all for this.
No.
Josiah, does your world have a villain, or is the conflict the main thing? Is there an NPC that is the villain, or is the conflict just people losing powers?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting to think about whether or not you're like, if you're going to build into that, because your characters don't need to know that there's a villain immediately for there to be a villain. You can have a villain that shows up in arc 2 or 3, and it's all built off of the same problem. I think I'm going to go with there's not a core villain, there's a systemic problem, because we love problematic systems.
I will say,
amazing.
Side note here, and I heard this from another guy, so I think this is pretty. It was DM Slayer was the guy who was talking about it, but he talked about specifically how if you don't have a villain, that is totally fine. But you have to realize you have removed your active chess piece from the board, and so creating problems for you can't just have a person that wants to get in the way of your heroes. You now have to create almost environmental problems that want to get in the way of your heroes. And that can be a more difficult thing. It is sometimes easier as a new DM to just have a villain that can want to foil the heroes and be the foil to the heroes and intentionally get in their way. But it can be really interesting from a story standpoint to say, hey, this, like, what Ocarina of Time where the moon's falling or whatever, and it's like, this is kind of the problem right now. We got to fix this, People are losing their superpowers. We got to discover a cure. And maybe that DM later down the line says, oh, it actually, a bunch of scientists in a lab created this, and now you have somebody behind your problem. But maybe it's, how did these powers come to be in the first place,
And like, when you're working with systems, don't be afraid to have, you can have like a lot of villains. If it's a systemic problem, the entire governmental system is a problem. You have lots and lots of villains that you have to fight through because everyone's protecting the system. And you have to work through layers to get to the big red button that turns it off. because everybody who works there understands this has to be in order for us to keep profiting. Stuff like that.
Yeah, totally.
So I'm going to ask for, I'll call it your first hurdle, Josiah, just to keep with the theme. What history might be relevant to your world and specifically to the plot at hand with these superpowers disappearing and leaving or not working properly? Tell us a little bit of history about what's the origin of superpowers? Are they lab grown? Are they naturally
Yeah.
occurring?
Two alien races both went to inhabit this planet at the same time. Neither of them had any sort of superpowers whatsoever. But in crossbreeding of these two races, their children, just like something about their DNA mixed in a way that just created these like superhuman type people. And so this was like a millennia ago. And so this has just been a systemic thing over and over. And over time, systems were put in place to help, secure the people for the greater good, et cetera, along those lines. Jobs and whole industries were built off of it. And that is sort of like the origin of how it came to be. So if they wanted to dig into the history, there's actually two completely separate histories of these different races that they could go way back into that could be prevalent today.
Gotcha. I got a
Amazing.
question then on top of that. How are you going to connect your players to action within this? You've said that the main conflict they're struggling with is losing their powers. Maybe they have lost their powers, sorry, I'm almost answering the question for you, but like, what are you going to do to connect your players to your world building and to make it relevant?
I think like, and this I love the way that these questions force you to build other things into your world immediately.
Yes.
So I'm like, oh, okay. So they were at the epicenter of one of the core events. Now they're being interrogated by the local law enforcement. So now there's a local law enforcement apparently, but now they're being interrogated about what they saw, who was there, what happened, and this is like bringing them in. And maybe they get like they're offered a reward if they can figure out the answer, or maybe they're like they need to do this for some sort of backstory reason. The way that the characters are connected is partially world building, and I think some of that can be built into it. But part of that is actually just knowing my players and knowing what characters they're building, I think is super, super important, because building a reason that they're connected, being like, well, actually, I'm a loner and I don't care about people. Okay, well, I need to build something very different for why you care about this then, because that would not help with what I was doing. Be like, I am a superhero. Well, it's really easy for me to connect you then.
Yeah, you're afraid of losing your powers.
Amazing.
No, that makes a lot of sense. I will say, I hope you can use the questions we're using, sure, but also the methodology. And I would encourage you could bring a friend in and do this with your, hey, ask me questions, especially if they care about you and care about the setting you're building. That can be really fun. You can also bring your players in. And we've done this before. Like, we've built worlds like this where, and the beauty of this, and this ties so much of what we've been talking about back into this. The beauty of this is you are not only world building and having them help do some of the heavy lifting and answering questions that their players would have. You're giving them all this information from the outset. These players are feeling rooted in this world. I don't need to ask you, like, what is the main thing in this? What is the history of this world? What is, the main conflict? What is the culture? I'm hearing it as you're coming up with it. And there is some brainstorming going on, and I can give you certain ideas and when I do, as a player, I am actually telling you, hey, these are the parts of your world I'm interested in. Can you make more of this? Can you and you are getting handed the playbook of like, here's how to make a world that's going to engage this player by the questions they're asking, by what they're interested in. And so I really would encourage you. There are plenty of ways to do world building, wrong ways to really do it. You can waste your time doing it, but I think this is such an effective thing because you're knocking out so many things at the same time. You are teaching your players about the world. You are getting them to buy in and engage. You are taking some of the heavy lifting off of yourself to create this stuff as they're asking you questions and you're coming up with answers. And there are dangers to this system, and we might, dive into that a little bit, but like, it really does help you just get the ball rolling with so much of this stuff.
Yeah. it is so fun as a player to be able to have a relationship with your DM, and where they're okay with you being a part of the world building process. There have been many times where we have been already in the campaign, already playing, and I said, or one of us had said, "Hey, what if this is something that is going on? Like, what if I had this big family that was connected to this thing?" Sometimes it's pre-built, or like sometimes these conversations are once we've already playing, but a lot of these conversations can happen early on too, of just being involved and saying, "Hey, I really like what you're talking about with the superhero world. What if there's also there's a subsect of this original race that has like become monstrous, and they also live like on a sub layer of the world," and be like, "I love that idea." And feel free to be like, "No, I think that actually takes away," but like allowing your players to be a part of some of that world building, to make suggestions, to add things in of like, "Hey, I was thinking of playing a character that does this. Could this be an aspect of the world?" And then I could play a character out of that. Is like a lot of that. Like we talked a lot about this in session 0, but letting your players be a part of the creation of the world makes them feel so much more implanted into it.
Yes. And I just want to add on to this, right? And I will let you in on a little bit of a secret here. DMs, this is extremely hard.
Yeah.
It sounds awesome. It sounds idealistic. Yeah, I'd love to have my players like help me world build because I do a lot of work in this. But also think to yourself, I do a lot of work on my world. And if my player comes in and says, "Well, I really like this aspect that you haven't put a lot of work into, or maybe that you don't really care about in your world," that can be really hard to feed that player. It also can be really hard when a player takes something that you loved and you were like, "This is the best thing ever." And they're like, "What if instead of this, it was actually just a really bad, evil corporate businessman that is running the entire world?" And it's like, well, that's not as fun as what I was thinking. But if you're really excited about that, I don't know what I should do. And it can be really, really hard. And we have been through this on the really, really hard end. And I didn't have a lot of mercy for my players. And I was like, "Look, you have to build the world at some point." And I said that very aggressively. It wasn't, my proudest moment in my life. But yes, please understand that this players be super gentle with your DMs. DMs be super gentle with your players, because there's this weird thing in D&D that I think is so important that we often forget. And that is that we are telling stories, and stories are core to who we are as people. There is a way, like all of your memory in life is story based. Anytime that you try to recall something, we'll tell a story about it. You're not just going to regurgitate information to them as facts and lines and data. It will be like, "So I was in class and we were talking about blank thing, and you begin to tell me a narrative and a story about this." And so when you step into D&D and you have begun to create a story and to create a world in which a story is going to take place, it can be very vulnerable to allow people to look at it and say, "I like this, I don't like this, this is great, this is not great." And it can be very vulnerable to be willing to say, "I want you to enjoy this story the most, and therefore I will let you change it." So, as the three of us have been through this, and none of us were gentle about it the first time that we went through it, and we actually got to a point where like we had to sit down as friends and just like rehash everything and say, "Okay, I love playing D&D, but I would rather maintain this friendship than continue to be frustrated about D&D." And the three of us sat down for about an hour, 2, 3. It was college, so
We've talked
1
for
hour.
so long,
Exactly.
so often.
Uh, but yeah, we had to say, "Okay, this is what these are the lines here." And that was amazing. I still think of it as one of the best conversations in my life that I've ever had. And that is what I would say. Like, yes, I will never, ever, ever say that players shouldn't have a place in world building. They should. I can now say confidently that I make better worlds when people are helping me do it than I do by myself, because I only have so many ideas and my players have so many different ideas and they're all good. But just be a little bit careful.
Yeah. I want to take that because I think it transitions into our last question really well. And I want to talk about the other half of that. Elijah just described so well the hardship that the DM goes through. And I want to talk about the hardship the player goes through. Our last question is, what role do players have with world building? What is the role that they are supposed to take on here? And I want to start out by saying it is not being the DM. If the DM has the humility and desire to create a story that you enjoy so much that he opens up his world to you and says, yeah, you can build some of this with you. Be respectful. Holy cow. Like, this is kind of an honor in some ways. This is DM. Like, this does not happen at every table. In fact, most tables, it does not happen. And if you want to pursue this with your players, or if your players want to pursue this with you, there needs to be a level of respect. And that is what we had to get to as friends, was like, okay, we have to go to our relational aspect below the game, to look at this in a kind of a meta light of like, there needs to be a respect here. If Elijah, as the DM, says, this is what my world's going to be, that's okay. And as a player, that makes things better. When you control the world, you lose this really fun aspect of not being in control, and your player needing to grapple with things outside of himself that are bigger than him, because that's life for most of us. And there is this place where, like, when you are in control and you twist the DM's arm and you get what you want and everything, you lose some of the beauty of that storytelling. And so the first thing I would say for players is, like, it is hard, but sometimes just don't criticize the DM. Don't, force him to always have an explanation for stuff. If he says this is the way it goes, you respect that.
You can criticize a little bit, but not in the moment. Don't be like, well,
be respectful. Talk about things after the game for sure, especially if you have concerns or other stuff. But, like, there's also a place, like, where we can say, hey, the DM position is deserving of a different kind of respect than the player position. And the players, like, the contract that is happening, the social contract between DM and players, is that the DM is the referee, is the adjudicator, is the narrative story builder behind the scenes for this story. You get to be the player. You get to experience it and put yourself in those shoes. And that's an incredible experience. But there is a contract here that you will respect the rulings of the DM, that this is their, you often hear it called their table. And I don't think that's wrong. I think there's a place for that to be true. And so, the player can play such a big part. That's what we've been talking about this entire time, is how the player can play a role in world building. But for that to happen, the player has to understand that they are not the DM, and that there is a place for them to maybe be a part of this. And there's a place for them to respect the DM and to step back and say, I want to not be in control here, but I also want to help you and give ideas, and I care about this world too. Anything to add to that, go ahead, or anything that you think players should help with world building. I'd love to hear that from you guys too.
I think there are a lot of, I completely agree with everything you were saying there for sure. I think that there are things that are helpful to have the players be a part of, and there are things that are not necessarily things the player needs to be a part of. I don't know how helpful it is for the player to say, oh, can the villain be this guy? And I would like him to have this relationship with the villain. And can I like have this backdoor way of killing the villain already pre-set up? Some of those things. If you're giving away like a lot of agency of your world in the actual play, like the actual gameplay of your world to your players, you've probably given them too much. They can maybe help with some of the structure of things, but if they are asking or trying to create worlds where they have more power, where they have more abilities, where they where they're giving extra weaknesses to other things, they're probably asking for the wrong reasons, and they maybe shouldn't be included in those things. Elijah, do you have things to say about what that line is between what things should and shouldn't be given to your players?
I think it's weird because I love it when players are like, can I have a relationship with the villain in some capacity? And like, can that be my dad? Can that be my uncle? Can that be, I remember at one point when I first started DMing, a player came up to me and was like, okay, I don't know if your campaign has a villain yet or not, but I would love for them to be my twin brother. And I secretly agree with everything that they're doing and would like to betray the party. And I was like, that's a little bit much for the casual game that we're going for here. Uh, but I love the idea. Let's pursue that, right? Similarly, I'm pretty particular as a DM. I am like, hey, I get to control one thing in this game, and that is every single monster. I'm not going to let you guys pick those. If you say, hey, I've really wanted to fight a mind flayer, then yes, I can put a mind flayer in the game, but that doesn't mean that will be the next thing that you come across. I want to build a story that builds to why are there mind flayers here? And I think for me, it's always motivation. Why do you want this thing? Is it because I've had players request magic items. Jack has requested several magic items for his characters, and they make a lot of sense because, hey, this is a magic item that would make me a lot more powerful that I would know exists because it's common or maybe uncommon at best. And it's like, can I be on the lookout for this? Absolutely. Yes. In fact, you can order one from Gizmo's shop of magical shipping. Like, I don't know. And to build in these things where it's like, hey, why do you want this? Is it so that I can just insta kill the villain? Okay, no, you probably can't have that. Seems a little bit ridiculous. But if it's like, hey, I'd like to have this so that my character can go through some struggle or so that my character can have something that keeps tying them to the plot, absolutely. I'm happy to work with you on that. And I think that it is a give and take. And sometimes you should give a little bit more and be okay with that. And sometimes you are allowed to put your foot down and be like, no, I don't think that I'm going to allow you to play as a full-fledged adult dragon secretly in human form for the duration of this campaign, because that gives you too much power. And I think there's one thing that I just think is really important when it comes to world building, right? As a DM, as a player, the goal is to play D&D or whatever TTRPG you are currently playing, and don't let that goal get pushed aside as you try to build a world. You're trying to play a game, and I think it is super easy for that game to get lost if you start focusing in on every little tiny detail. I remembered when I was in college, I was DMing about 6 different campaigns all at once. And one of them I was playing every night from about 10 p.m. to 4 o'clock in the morning, sometimes later, with these two wonderful guys right here.
Yeah.
And somebody came up to me that I had never met before, and they're like, I heard you DM. And I was like, yes, I do. And they're like, well, how much world building should I do? And I that question like really stuck with me. And I was like, and I don't know why, but it was like, how much world building should I do? Because I do a lot. And when I was thinking about it, and I have come to the conclusion that the amount of world building that you need to do as a DM and a little bit as a player is just enough to get you through the session and a little more. And that is what that means is you don't need to have everything figured out, right? You don't need to be able to explain the entire world, but you also need to have something that the players can put their feet on and take a step forward. And if you do that and have that as your campaign, you are going to be set when it comes to world.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. And I think we're getting close to wrapping up here. But to add on to that, I honestly, just to kind of talk about this a little bit more generally, I love having these conversations with you too. And specifically, I love hearing what's inside of Elijah's brain as he's prepping and knowing what's inside of my brain as I'm prepping and seeing how different. And I struggle on the other end of what Elijah does. Elijah is an over prepper. He's I'm going to write, an entire Silmarillion to my world so that there is so much that you can uncover and dig into. And I am like, I will write whatever you guys want to know, when you want to know it, and not a second before, because I might get in the mood and I might write a lot, but more than likely, I will wait until you want to know it and then make it.
Jack
And
is
I
just as
have
surprised
found
as we are as to find what's behind the door.
you just make stuff up. But I have found for my style of DMing, it is really good for me to just build a lot of strings that people can pull on. For Elijah, it is like, hey, I need to sometimes build less. For me, it is like, I need to build a little more. And I'm going to build these strings that people can pull on. And when they pull, it's a little bit of a delayed effect, but I give them the answer because I'm creating it then. I say, oh, they're pulling on this string. They want to know what's here. I'm going to make that. And then when the mood does hit me, when I have a couple of days off from work for a holiday or something, and I got time on my hands, yeah, I'll sit down and I'll start chipping away at that world building. But like, I hope this gives you an idea and hope for the fact that like, this doesn't have to be this complex, like thing that you have all of it perfectly sculpted beforehand. And in fact, part of the joy of D&D is sculpting a story with your friends and like making that together. And there is a place to build that with them as you go on. And neither style is wrong. There are pros and cons to both of us. I spend a lot less time worrying about this stuff, and I get a lot more time for my life and other things. And Elijah has way better worlds than I do. So, there's a give and a take here.
Find a healthy medium, because I definitely write too much.
But also, yeah, it's also what you can do and what you enjoy doing. Don't burn yourself out on the hobby doing what you don't love. Do what you do love, and that your players will probably love that too. So,
yeah, for sure. And just get started. The more that you play the game, the more that you DM, the more that you just get into things, the more you'll start to understand which things are important and which things maybe just you can kind of do as you go. I have not DM'd a lot, but this one of the last campaigns we did was just a quick little one shot. I threw it together in a couple hours, and I have not DM'd a lot, but the more that I got into it, the more that I realized some of these things I just sort of instinctually know which things I don't need to put as much effort into, and some of these things are like, this is really exciting. I'm gonna keep building more of this. And the more that you just get into it, the more that you just do it, the more you'll sort of understand, these are the things I got to put more effort into. And these are the things that I'll figure it out as we go. Maybe I'll put more strings. Maybe I'll hide a turtle there. Maybe I'll fill a book with 100,000 pages. You kind of just go through what you need to do. I hope this conversation has been helpful. I hope that you start joining us in sort of this way that we think through and think about world building and how to create a world and what it looks like to maybe incorporate your players, maybe build some of the world together, and what are some of the questions to ask. And there are so many questions you can ask. We asked a handful. We had another handful we could have asked as well, because there's so much that you can prep and so much you can get into. As much time as you have, you can use it. But as we wrap this up, we are going to have a lot more things to talk about. We want to keep talking about these things. We love to talk about things. We do not have all of the answers. We are not sure what we're talking about, but we love to talk about it. We have a bunch of experience, and we're going to keep talking about it. So yeah, expect in some of our future episodes, we're going to be talking a decent amount about storytelling and plot and how to tie your worlds together and make them feel really impactful and like they're going in different directions. We're going to talk a lot about that in the future. So thanks for listening to Tales About the Table with me, Josiah, my friends Elijah and Jack. Yeah, we'll see you next time.